I'm honored that yeah, I was selected, and I'm honored to be part of the Corteva Symposium series. And I'll be presenting and discussing a large body of work across the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and especially in our agricultural development program. And you'll see it has some of the examples I'll touch on of some of the investments we've made will be very specific and connected to breeding. But I think the overall theme I would present is around integrated and bundled solutions, right? So breeding has huge value. New crop varieties have large value, but if they're presented in a context that doesn't include the other required elements for a successful crop, of course, that they can't realize their value. And so we try to bring together various solutions across the space to improve the lives of smallholder farmers, uh, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. So I'll with that I'll get into the discussion of the overall portfolio and a link to breeding. Hopefully, oh yeah, one more up. So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation global programs cover a wide range of activities. The focus, at least initially, was very much in public health and global health, and many of you know of that work through media. I'm part of a group called Global Growth and Opportunity that's focused more uh, on innovations across the space and in various areas associated with health, but not necessarily directly under it. And so it includes new hygiene solutions, education, nutrition, and the integration thereof, as well as financial services for the poor, which I'll be discussing a little bit. So just to give you an idea of where our group, Agricultural Development, sits within the Gates Foundation. And as you can read here, our ambition is really to work with countries. So that's what the country-led uh, focus is, for countries to forge their own paths for agricultural development. Some of the assumptions, hypothesis that we work on is that really no country has uh, moved, significantly moved forward in development without supporting and developing its agricultural sector. And so the concept of agricultural transformation is to enable countries to develop, grow, support their citizens through with agriculture in the lead. And we focus, especially in countries where many of the citizens are smallholder farmers, managing less than 1 hectare of land, and focusing on women empowerment, because often, you know, women have a huge value for the economy, but often are underserved and yeah, under leveraged, under leveraged for deriving agricultural solutions. So really want farmers to be empowered with tools, knowledge, and the systems to pull themselves out of poverty and to contribute to the economy. And so our group is really focused on making novel solutions that raise productivity potential for farmers, decrease their risk, um, and help them develop profitable organ companies or small as producers make money for their families, and they're able to put their kids to school and afford the things they need. And so I'm very focused in upstream development, so in research and development, and so really working into to de-risk technology, so for new innovations or new technologies, to take some of the risk out of them, for either technical risk or regulatory risk, and prepare them in a way that can be taken up by the private sector or by the public sector to scale in the environments, uh, and also to incentivize people across the value chain to take up the new knowledge and innovations, so that they can be scaled and can get to the farmers. So we're not doing research for research's sake, but we're uniquely placed to take lots of risk because we don't have shareholders and we don't have we don't have voters. So we're placed to take lots of risk and to help develop solutions that others may not. And so with that, this kind of, as we get into the look of our agricultural work, this is all in agriculture. We have a large group that's focused on innovation across different spaces, and I'll talk about these. Delivery, so of course, delivery needs to be driven in country, in part of the country system, so the policy, regulatory, business landscape of those countries. So we have people in country to help with deployment, and then enabling, so understanding advocacy, uh, policy systems, and kind of cross-cutting questions around women's empowerment, food systems, and climate change adaptation. But as a whole group, focusing on these four outcomes, which I described around increasing productivity, income, access to a nutritious diet year round, and increasing women's empowerment. And so we do everything in partnership. We do almost nothing alone. So as a private philanthropic foundation, we give money to various organizations associated with projects uh, to drive projects forward and solutions forward. So this is just a selection of some of the partners that we work with and I work with, and I'll be describing their work here. And it ranges, and you can see here the list across many different types of organizations, from startups to multinational private companies to the CGIAR to academia and UN agencies and multilateral organizations. And we partner very closely with other funding organizations from the EU as well as the UK, the United States, and private foundations as well. So trying to bring money together, kind of align what we're trying to do, and then work with partners who can help move things forward. And so how do we try to address the constraints in smallholder farmer systems? And so we have to identify both production constraints, things like new pests, new diseases, climate associated stresses or abiotic stresses, fertility, the danger of using inputs incorrectly, especially pesticides, as well as systems constraints. Farmers often don't have access to capital, so they can't invest in their farms if they don't have money to do so. They lack the right information. Transport systems prevent them from getting their goods to market, and therefore they can't sell them, and they're often kind of, no matter the ultimate value of their product, they often receive the least amount of money because they are at the end of the chain. And therefore, even in cases where there are nutritious foods around, often those are exported out and they're left with poor choices. And so really then, given the system constraints, given the production constraints, looking for new innovations, new technologies across these different areas that allow us to address one of these constraints directly, um, and provide an option for farmers to succeed in the marketplace. And so a lot of what we're talking about now, and you can see from the 6 things we have here, 2 of them are proud around improved genetics or seed for animals and plants, but also in terms of health, digital tools that enable the right use of the genetics and the health inputs, and then the systems as a whole. And so we work across lots of innovations in that space. And with that, I'll go through a few of the examples and across the different areas that I described. And so these are some of the areas in our digital farmer services portfolio around providing soil information services. So this is an area that Embrapa has put a lot of investment in, as well as the USDA in the United States. Understanding soil variability is huge around providing then targeted and appropriate agronomic advice for farmers. So we need to understand how the soils are variable, provide GIS solutions for soils, and then do the right agronomy research for helping provide input advice. And then, as I said earlier, just from a digital perspective, the need for bundled solutions to bring together that agronomic advice around what's the right crop, what's the right variety, what's the right agronomy, but also providing information around offtake markets and how they can sell the crop, because of course that can help determine which crop to grow, but also input around where to get the right inputs and also where to get financing to get those inputs. And so really the need from a digital perspective to bring all the information together to help farmers make the right decision. And then, as I said, both from inputs in terms of capital for farmers, but also insurance. So more developed countries have nice insurance systems and insurance markets. Uh, Many times, even in advanced nations, the smallholder farmer is left out of those systems because it's hard to access them. It's hard to understand the risk, and yeah, there's a fear that they would default more than others, which is often not even the case. Um, so, and then, especially recently, and I don't have to go over this too much. I mean, climate change is having huge impacts especially across the tropics, and especially for smallholder farmers who have very little. They don't have insurance often. They don't have a lot of financial support, and so one bad year can mean a huge negative impact on their livelihoods. Um, and so very focused on providing climate adaptation solutions in this kind of bundled approach, from new and improved seed varieties to better agronomic advice and tailored agronomic advice to insurance. And those are just an example of kind of how things come together. Um, but really, tracking changes, predicting changes is huge in the world of climate adaptation, where the past is not representative of what's going to happen in the future. And so really getting better surveillance information, and better frameworks to easily understand what's happening, and then do on-farm trialing to make sure that what information you're providing is relevant to that location and relevant to the current situations, but also using crop modeling and other modeling systems to predict what's going forward. I'm going to quickly touch on livestock. I don't think it's a huge focus of this talk or this meeting, but for smallholder farmers especially, this is very integrated with their crop production, where they grow crops to both feed their families and feed the livestock, and have dual use crops. And they actually have the advantage of being able to have multiple crops in a small area as well as livestock, and be able to balance and get a kind of diverse, risk managed farm. Uh, they have a lot more flexibility with everything being close and relatively small. So, but still, like with crops, focusing a lot on improved genetics, improved nutrition, uh, improved health, making sure that systems, both especially for sale of milk, sale of animals, that those are available, they have the right data and evidence to make decisions. All of those play into livestock in a very similar way they do into crops, but of course with different systems and different players. And now I'll go into kind of the more focused work around crops, especially around the portfolio I'm managing. And so one of the collaborations we've had, a long-standing collaboration with the University of Cambridge, is in using epidemiological models and surveillance to predict and give early warning systems for new pests and diseases. And so this exists in many other contexts, but especially for Africa, it's kind of underserved, as low quality and low intensity of weather data, and often not very established systems to help governments make the right decisions for how to prevent outbreaks. And of course, with climate change, those outbreaks are much more likely to happen and much harder to predict, given that things are changing so much. But these are some examples here of looking at wheat rust, that we've been working in this area for a long time, and it's kind of the foundation of CIMMYT and the CGIAR was looking with Norman Borlaug, and we're still working in that space because, of course, wheat rusts evolve very quickly. There's new races, there's new challenges, and so looking here at modeling where are the spores going to land, which of those areas are also suitable for the spores to develop, and then looking at based on where the wheat crops are, what is this risk, and then working especially with the Ethiopian government, but also with Kenya and others in East Africa to model the spread of new sources of wheat rust, new varieties, and help them then both place the varieties of wheat to make sure that they're resistant to the new strains, but also use any fungicides possible to control the rust, and optimize the use of their limited resources. Another example is in this the cassava viruses. Um, there's a few. There's kind of a complex of viruses that have impacted cassava, and they established mostly in East Africa, but are spreading to West Africa, where the majority of the cassava is grown in Africa, and trying to track out like where, with the movement of the white flies, which are the vector, where will those likely show up? What is the risk? Where do they need to put their surveillance resources to see how it's happening and to prevent large outbreaks in Nigeria, which are the biggest risk. So doing a lot of work in that disease modeling space and collaborating with lots of others. This is kind of associated with that many times. These are kind of some of these are some of the gene editing work that we're doing, uh, often focused on broad spectrum resistance to some of these diseases like the cassava bacterial blight, brown streak virus, which I just discussed. So of course, from a Nigeria perspective, we have a modeling program. It tells them where likely there'll be outbreaks or risks, and then that can help them position resistant varieties either through kind of native resistance or through gene edited resistance. And so trying to give options to smallholder farmers as well as to governments to make decisions around to be able to combat some of these challenges as they come up. So working on cassava viruses, working along a long-standing relationship with CIMMYT and Corteva around developing resistance to maize lethal necrosis, which is a disease that's had huge impact in East Africa, and is now actually very close to this trait is close to deployment thanks to improvements in the Kenyan regulatory system or clarifications there. But also working in rice, bacterial blight, and some new work around kind of nutrition and output traits for millet and groundnut as well. So exciting work in gene editing and getting the gene editing solutions out into the hands of the farmers. This is kind of an overview, relatively busy overview, but it does relate to the last discussion in as much as kind of rethinking how we do breeding and testing, especially in the CGIAR and the National Agricultural Research groups in the countries in which we work. But trying this allele mining project is a large new project funded by the Gates Foundation as well as FFAR and others, um, to mine and understand alleles in gene banks, as we just discussed, find adaptive alleles from sources within the gene banks through new analytics, and quickly, either through back crossing or through gene editing, get those alleles into elite varieties to address very important emerging problems in the space. That's a kind of a large area we're working in. I'll give a little bit more discussion later. And Dr. Coles will follow me discussing advanced phenotyping. We will also have a very large importance around measuring the right traits in the crop that are representative of the challenges so that we can make sure to breed the best varieties that are associated with the field. For smallholder farmers and in Africa, we face different constraints than you might face when you're working in Brazil or working in the US with very large fields and clear regulations. Here, we're often relying on the cell phone or mobile phone as our primary tool for phenotyping. So how do we use get the highest quality phenotype data, but only restricted to a phone. Understanding, as I said before, around the roles or kind of the modeling roles for understanding based on farm variance in environment, what are the best crops and what are the best varieties to grow there. So using on-farm information to predict the performance of different varieties and different crops in future climates, using then satellite data as well as crop growth models to be able to better provide this information around the agroecological niche. And some of these tools could be available, kind of trained for Africa, but used globally, especially as the same crops are grown in similar types of environments. And then finally, move towards using new technologies and tools for on-farm testing. So this also gets to the use of mobile phones and the enablement of kind of local on-farm managers to collect high-quality phenotypes in the field on farm. Traditionally at the CGIAR, a lot of that has been done on research station, but that doesn't tie and connect to what the smallholder farmer really lives. And the goal of all of this is to develop better varieties with better in the bag recommendations on how those need to be grown. Oops, I'll step through this. Oops. So just from the allele mining perspective, we're focused both on the identification of alleles for disease and pest resistance, as I've described, like with the cassava virus description, but trying to work across the space and identify those alleles from gene banks and move them into elite varieties, but also for climatic stress. And the method we're using is actually to use the what's called passport data, the information that came with the collection, the original collection of a gene bank accession. So we have new seed, you collect it from a specific place. We know the environmental, the historical and future environmental situation for where that was collected. And then based on the location information of where each was collected, we can then assume that varieties that were collected in a certain area had adaptations to that stress, or the stress is predominant in that area, and then use analytics to identify possible alleles or haplotypes that provide adaptation to those stresses. So it's not growing, we don't grow them all in the same area. We assume that since they came from that area and were successful there, that they must have adaptations for those stresses, and then identify the markers associated with those. As I said, with on-farm trials, there's an evolution in both the tools as well as the methodology, and also just capacity. So training people to run these trials well. But really, we want to target genetic variation to local conditions and running these trials. So a lot of these trials have actually, this method originated in Latin America and is now being applied towards an African context. But really, the challenge is to collect appropriate data, high quality phenotype data with a very little training lift or training need, and make it very intuitive. So new methods are there, both digital methods as well as just methodological approaches. And then I'll get a little bit into the advanced phenotyping space. One of the huge challenges that we have for smallholder farmers and for Africa in general is there's very little ground truth data. So it's very hard to collect data in the field at scale. And so we're working with the University of California at Davis to develop 3D plant simulations where we can take photos, take measurements in the field that parameterizes the 3D model. And then we can use that 3D model to develop crops attuned to that variety and the variety characteristics, but grow that in 10 million different environments over 10 million different years, because it's all a simulated environment. Collect a lot of simulated training data, and then in that simulation compare back against new real world measurements to kind of develop this method where real world is augmented by simulated, and then we determine how well that represents and predicts into the real world again. So this has been used in other training scenarios. This is an example from CarCraft for Google, but there's other cases where simulated data are used to boost these types of neural network models. And then, as I said, like in Africa, this is the type of solution we can provide on phone-based computer vision solutions. The question really is, how can we use, and these are examples, how can we use data from different phenotyping platforms, like a large robot, small robot, glasses, or other very small portable solutions, and really kind of build solutions across the space, but then deploy methods on phone. And so leverage information that we might be able to get. You can get terabytes of information on this single plot with these types of tools. How do you learn from those terabytes to provide then a trained model here that works in field, works on farm? And so really then each one of these has its specific value, has a specific tool, but really, you could use this system and deploy on drone, use the system, deploy on phone, or actually, so really it's this kind of whole suite of solutions that hopefully train a core model set. I'll probably skip that given the time is very complicated anyway, but I'll get into the last slide here around how we're using crop growth models for this agroecological zonation. So finding the best places for crops and varieties. And so we're working with a startup called Regrow that has integrated a crop growth model with satellite imagery to develop these types of zonations and predictions for high-income countries. And we're adapting and adopting this with new weather data sources from a startup called tomorrow.io, new soil data from a investment that we made called the African Soil Informatics Services, as well as partnering with NASA around satellite data and satellite data analytics to try to develop a crop model that can be boosted and used, parameterized quickly and cheaply to apply to a lot of new crops, a lot of new varieties, and in a complex growing systems. And then the on-farm trialing data can then provide us a realized yield that then we can both use for parameterization, but also validation to make sure that the models are actually working. The ultimate goal of this is per crop, per variety, and per crop to be able to model the potential yield, to understand with a crop growth model possible attainable yields given the existing agronomic and input restrictions and system in the area, and then compare that to actual measurements, and then look at the difference between these and see where might interventions have the biggest impact, where might new varieties have the biggest impact, and where things are going pretty well and we don't need to understand, we don't need to work much harder. The problem, of course, is that attainable and potential yields are very dependent upon the climate situation. So we need to not only know the climate situation and get much better meteorological data, but also be able to predict it into the future around extreme, the increased frequency of extreme events. And once again, to connect back onto the partnerships piece, and this does link to the whole symposium and our outreach programs. Really, we need to work together to solve the problems of the people who are very much at risk and very exposed to the coming and existing climate challenges. And just need to all pull together and look forward to continued and future partnerships. So thank you very much.